Welcome back after the break. When we entered the break, we were discussing the economic infrastructure resource base in Canada, and now time has come to have a look at polity, governance, and related issues. Canada is a federal polity, and so are we. But I think the Canadian federalism is far more vibrant than at the moment Indian federalism is. I mean, I think the way the reconciliation came to the Quebec issue is the triumph of federalism. And I had the good fortune to interact with some federalists from Canada when the International Federalist Conference took place in Delhi some years back. And I think, could you tell us a little more about that how has this federal way of governance evolved in Canada?
It works well because the provinces are really their own entities, okay? So the responsibilities of the federal government are very well defined. And the responsibilities of the provincial government are well defined. So we know that when it comes to education and healthcare, those are provincial responsibilities. When you talk about foreign affairs, it's a federal responsibility. So that's quite well defined. When you talk about transfer payments, which are an important part to create some equity across the country, there are some provinces that have provinces and some that have not. And the government's in the process of being able to transfer money in a way that would create some equity across the country. So it's always there's a tension, but it's a healthy tension in terms of being able to come up with the compromises necessary to be a federal organism globally, and at the same time each province maintains its own identity and its own ability to function and operate. So, and again, we're 10 provinces and 3 territories, so it's a little different than India where you have 28 states and maybe more, where it's probably much more difficult to govern in that context. When you talk about Quebec, for example, I grew up as an Anglophone in Quebec, and you know it's a history and an evolution that for most of the world is hard to understand unless you've actually lived in that environment. And it's a fundamental healthy compromise that we've come to over a period of time, and it's understanding that we are 3 founding people, you know, English, French, and First Nation people. It's an understanding that we have 2 languages in Canada, English and French, and it's understanding that, you know, as a Quebecer, even I as an Anglophone, you have an identity within the rest of the country. And that doesn't come easily, and it comes with a lot of talk and a lot of compromise and a lot of mutual understanding. And I think we're at a stage, I still think you'll have a sense of nationalism in Quebec, which will have an impact on some in terms of sovereignty. But I think there's also an understanding now that Quebec is really an integral part of Canada, and that's what defines who we are as a country. If we didn't have Quebec, we wouldn't be Canada. And that's what's so important about, having come from that culture, I feel very comfortable being able to explain it.
This leads us to the most interesting question about multicultural Canada and the plural ethnic identities that there are. There is this, again, a reflection of what we have in this country. How has Canada lived with its multicultural, multi-ethnic profile?
Fundamentally, you have to remember, Canada is an immigrant country. Almost everybody except First Nation people immigrated to Canada. And our country is, you know, roughly 400 or 500 years old, right? Depending on when you want to talk about the first explorers coming to the country. So we've always welcomed immigration. I mean, it was always part of who we are and how we evolved as a country. We wouldn't have been able to grow the country without immigration. So it's fundamental to the understanding that we all have when we live in Canada. You expect and you enjoy the fact that we are multicultural. There's also respect for people's culture, which I think is important. So when you come to our country, it's not that we want you to become a Canadian. What we want you to be able to do when you come to the country is respect Canadian values. And I think that's fundamental. So you can be an Indian, an Indo-Canadian, or a Canadian of Indian origin, and still maintain your culture, your religions, whatever they may be, practice those, speak the language. But fundamentally, that if you're going to live within Canada, there are certain things that you have to respect, and those are the values that we as Canadians have, right? Respect for one another, being able to have openness and transparency in our process, a freedom to do what you want to be able to do, and not impose your culture or your religion on other people. Let people make their own decisions. So that's all part of what the values are. So we don't want you to don't be a Canadian. I mean, we want you to be who you are, but respect what it means to be a Canadian.
What is the political representation of people who are of, say, visible minorities, as you put them, in Parliament, in Senate? Because I believe there are 10 in the national
Yes,
Parliament.
there is 10 in the House of Commons of Indo-Canadian origin. I don't know what the total number would be, but...
But this would be only the Indo-Canadians.
Indo-Canadian,
so the number of visible minorities would be much more than this if you counted the others.
Absolutely. Okay. So we have Canadians of Japanese origin, Canadian of Chinese origin in the House of Commons. We have First Nation Canadians of First Nation. So we cover the spectrum.
Another thing which amazed me was that the rate of population growth of First Nation people is almost double than the rest of it.
Yes.
So they are growing in numbers. They are not sort of disappearing.
Yeah, and they're well. And again, we've had our challenges as you read historically, and I think we're really turned the corner. A lot of fundamentally, it's recognizing the fact that the First Nation people are a fundamental part of our fabric in Canada, and how I started my career when I first started working on Indian reserves in Northern Ontario. So I've had my experience with that type of environment, and I have to say we didn't do a good job historically in that area. I think we've done a much better job today in understanding what the needs and requirements are. We've done a much better job in being able to deal with the land claims issues. And so if you take a look, I don't know if you watched the Olympics, and you saw part of everything that was involved the Olympics in Vancouver involved the First Nation people, because 4 First Nation bands were an integral part of the land on which the Olympics were held. So they had to be integrated into that fabric of that event. And it was, I think we did a wonderful job in doing that. So we've understood how important that population is to who we are. Again, just like French Canada is an important part of Canada, the First Nations. And it's been neglected, but I think has changed a tremendous amount in the last 20 years.
Common misperception is that Canada follows the lead which the US gives, but they tend to forget that Canada has an independent line. It did not want to go into Iraq, and it has had a very interesting mix of policy in Afghanistan, 3Ds, diplomacy, development, and democracy.
Right.
And it does carry sort of its own foreign policy objectives and amended differently. Right. So would you like to expatiate a little on that?
It's sometimes hard to have a foreign policy that you could differentiate from the United States because it's our neighbor. We share a lot of common values, and it's right next door. So it's difficult, for people outside to say, well, why is Canada different? But you have to live in our country to understand that our origins, are European in a lot of ways. Our thinking may be somewhat different than the United States. When you talk about, mottos, it's life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in the United States. In Canada, it's peace, order, and good governance. So it's a different approach to how you would look at just basically operating as individuals in the society. So that translates into different approaches to foreign policy. And we, we would, if you take a look at Libya, we were very much involved, but that's because we are part of a multinational organization, NATO, and we contribute to NATO, and when you take, and that was the same reason why we were in Afghanistan. So because we're a small country population-wise, it's important for us as a trading nation to be an integral part of the multinational, multilateral community. So we tend to join multilateral institutions. We tend to seek a compromise and consensus. So it's a little bit different than the United States in terms of how we evolve from a foreign policy perspective. It's just, again, the psychology is a little bit different.
You have a very close relationship with the United States, forget about the foreign policy, even in the economic sphere. Right. So there is NAFTA and there is the free trade area between Canada and the United States. And when you talk in terms of Canadian membership of multilateral organizations like NATO or UN, is there a conflict of interest at times or contending pulls?
Well, I mean, certainly over Iraq, there was a conflict of interest based fundamentally. We had a hard time reconciling the American view on Iraq. I mean, it was just we didn't share that approach, and we didn't share the belief that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. So, yes, we took a different line, and it's who we are. On trade, for example, when I was in working in the United States, 86% of our exports went to the U.S. We're now down to 74. So again, the reliance on the U.S. is still very strong, but it's not what it used to be. And there is a real sense of importance in being able to integrate our economy with the economies, particularly in the Asia Pacific. So there's a lot of focus on by our Prime Minister on India in particular, and China, and a desire to do what is required to build those collaborations. We will chart a different path in the United States in a lot of areas.
And what remains of the old Commonwealth network? Because when I was growing up as a child in school, Commonwealth seemed to be the tie which united India and Canada, India and United Kingdom, India and Australia and New Zealand. And now, in a new globalized world, these ties are being either loosened or reinforced or reshaped.
Well, I think everything adapts with time, and I still think as Commonwealth partners, we're Commonwealth friends. I mean, I think there is that underlying understanding that exists, and so it's important to us to be able to be a good, strong partner with the Commonwealth. And as you said, it was a fundamental element of the relationship between Canada and India, and it was a very strong relationship between Prime Minister Nehru and Prime Minister Pearson, and there was a great friendship, and it was a Commonwealth friendship.
And I also remember Pierre Trudeau used to be such a hit in India when he came. People remember his unorthodox sliding down the banisters of the stairs, and his charm and his charisma.
Yeah, well, that's it's great to have that type of personality. Everybody brings a different dimension, and our current Prime Minister has a very good relationship with Prime Minister Singh, and it's based on the fact that they're both economists and they can relate, and they have a great relationship. So I think it goes to one of the, having spent as much time as I have in Greater China, and we absolutely enjoyed our time in China. What I find that's somewhat different is the ability to make great friends in India. People are very warm. It's not that they're not warm in India, but language and subtleties allow you to develop those relationships which are really long-term and lasting, and beyond what I would call sort of a casual type of relationship. You can't have casual relationships with Indians. It's really a good friendship, so it's a difference.
Where does Russia figure in the foreign policy perspective of Canada?
Well, it figures in, as you can imagine, in a big way over the Arctic. Okay, so a fundamental platform plank of our Prime Minister and the current government is Arctic sovereignty. With global warming, access to the Arctic is going to be a lot easier, and obviously we believe most of that Arctic is within Canadian territory. So fundamentally, it's a foreign policy issue, and it's one that has got a lot of focus and attention from the government. So Russia is important. And Russia is a friend in a number of ways, but a competitor in a number of ways also for natural resources and energy and the such like. So
we have covered a lot of ground about politics, energy resources, geography. Time perhaps to turn to the life, fun and games, culture in Canada.
Sure.
But time for another break. Pardon me for a short interruption. Please stay with us. Resume the conversation with us right after the break. Trade remains minuscule, $4.5 billion a year.
Yeah.
And even if it becomes 300 folds by 2015, is not really too much in volume terms.
Not when you have the two economies that are $1 trillion each. And this isn't meant as an excuse, but a lot of product that comes to India from Canada goes through third markets, so it doesn't get captured in the statistics. We have 600 engines on airplanes in India that were manufactured in Montreal. So those engines will go to Europe or they'd go to the US before they'd actually end up in India.